This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like and find fascinating. This episode is brought to you by Tel Aviv University's Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism and Racism. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. All you have to do is go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us, because we're counting on you and every little helps. I am delighted to be joined today by Jan Grabowski. He's Professor of History at the University of Ottawa in Canada and one of the most prominent scholars of the Holocaust in Poland. His new book, Night Without End, The Fate of Jews in German-occupied Poland, which he co-edited and co-wrote together with Barbara Engelking, is forthcoming in English, and it will be published shortly by Indiana University Press and Yad Vashem. Professor Jan Grabowski, welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for your kind invitation. Nice to be here.
So, exactly a year ago, you joined me and Dalia, my co-host, to discuss your previous book, The Hunt for the Jews, which, like your most recent one, has a very evocative title. It's rather unusual for a scholarly piece of work. So maybe a good way to start the conversation about Night Without End would be to explain the title. Why did you choose it and what it signifies?
Well, actually, it comes from a poet, from a poem by a very famous Polish poet Miłosz. But it actually is a larger. It requires to introduce a larger context. It is a book which sort of fits in a series of books which I and a group of my co-authors and colleagues wrote over the years, which focus on areas which have in Poland, which had largely been forgotten in the mainstream historiography, because normally you have, when you think about a Holocaust in Poland, people make reference to the Warsaw Ghetto, to the walls, and then to extermination and so on. We were looking at the areas in which vast majority of Polish Jews lived and died, which is areas, let's say, distant from large cities, rural areas, small towns, and these areas resembled night in terms of our lack of knowledge of these areas. So, hence the title, and so it's a part of a larger research project.
Mm-hmm. And the reason that those areas have been overlooked by historiography, I'm assuming one of the reasons is that the great majority of Polish Jews actually lived in the cities and not in these provincial areas, right? But what according to you, explains that blind spot? Because, there's so much scholarly and lay interest in the Holocaust in Poland. How do you explain that?
Well, the thing is that large greatest centers, such as, for instance, Warsaw, Łódź or Kraków, dominated historical scene because the volume of written evidence dominated the field. In small areas, Jews were much less organized. They left much less in terms of paperwork. And the focus, therefore, was on these large closed ghettos, which left abundant documentary evidence, such as Ringelblum's archive, tens of thousands of documents which constitute this great body of knowledge. And then when you move to little shtetls, where you have Jewish population of about 40 to 60, 70% of all pre-war population, the evidence is much less so. And then you have the entire vast numbers of Jews who are living simply in rural areas, underreported, practically unknown in historiography. So we wanted to, let's say, give voice back to people who were largely forgotten in the historical narrative.
But they're also relatively few as opposed to the...
Not really.
No?
Because we were looking, when I mentioned small places, I meant these shtetls. That's where majority actually of Polish Jews lived. So if you look at towns, shtetls of 5 to 15,000 people, those are the areas that I and my colleagues focused upon. And that's where actually close to 70% of Polish Jews lived. So this is why this is why we decided to shed light on less, let's say, spectacular in terms of accounts, but very important parts of the story.
And is there something substantive about the difference in the experience, the Jewish experience, maybe the Polish attitudes, the policies of the Germans, all those aspects that you were looking at in the provincial experience versus the urban experience?
Right. First of all, that the thing which has been largely overlooked is the practical. In practical terms, it's that people in the ghettos, in largest ghettos, were sealed away, cut off from the so-called bystanding Polish society. The walls prevented not all, but most of these contacts. Now, in all of these smaller ghettos, they were so-called open ghettos or semi-open ghettos, and the contacts with so-called Aryan side, with non-Jews, were frequent, were extraordinarily rich, and practically undocumented too. So if you think ghetto, you think isolation. Not true. What we found in reality was that there were huge problems related to various policies directed against these more distant Jews, but what was the crucial difference was that they were, until practically the very end, they were living within a larger society. They were not really isolated. Not that it changed their end and their final destination all that much. Mind you, if you look at Polish Jews overall, the chances for survival, whether you were living in a large city or a small town, were to the order of 1%. So 1% of Polish Jews who found themselves under Nazi rule survived. There were 250,000 who fled to the Soviet Union, but they never encountered the Germans. They came back after the war. But those who remained under the Nazi rule, 1% survived. So the chances, whether you were in a small place or large place, the fates were in the beginning very different. At the end of the day, however, the tragic fate resembled one and to the other.
Yeah, and what about the attitudes of the Polish population in the provinces versus urban areas?
Right. Well, here you have, the thing is that in rural areas, we tried to look at these small towns and see how the Jewish population reacted to the evolving policy of terror. We mostly looked at something which has not been studied before in a large detail, which is so-called Aktionen. Aktionen were the German so-called liquidation actions. This is the time in 42 and sometimes early 43 when the Germans simply take the Jewish population in atmosphere of utmost horror, and they deport these people in death trains to the death sites such as Treblinka, Bełżec, Sobibór, Auschwitz later on nearby. And what happens here, we tried to see how this liquidation, who was taking part in this liquidation. And one of our findings, which was extraordinary, I would say important, is that the Germans were here conducting these operations in this atmosphere of utmost horror and terror with substantial assistance from various local actors. There was Polish collaborationist Blue Police, there were Polish voluntary firefighters. There were finally masses of local people who wanted to take a financial advantage of the evolving situation. So all of this was something that we studied, and then we wanted to look beyond the actions, and our second step was to look at people who were Jews who avoided deportation to the extermination sites and who went into hiding. Because these people had really good shot at survival. And we tried simply to calculate. We went to the level in a micro-research, so-called. We wanted to look at numbers. Because usually in the history of the Holocaust, the numbers are overwhelming. We are saying many, majority, most. Well, we in this book, what's original actually, we 9 authors, we went after 9 counties of Poland, and we descended to the level of individual individual trajectories. So you could actually count the heads. Given the 1% of survivors, it was possible. So we were looking how many fled, what has happened, what did they try to do in order to survive, who prevented them from surviving. And all these questions, there are so many that I could spend a long time explaining, but the thing is, all of them in a way make a contribution to our knowledge, because these things were more or less unknown before.
Yeah, but can you determine in broad strokes, is it possible at all to say that the rural experience of Jews during the Holocaust was different from the urban one because of, I don't know, the different social fabric, different patterns of living, and different type of Jewish and non-Jewish relations?
Yes. For instance, in rural areas, in small towns, Jews were much less assimilated. Jews living in large cities, by and large, were more assimilated, which had a significant impact because, for one, they could speak unaccentuated Polish, which had absolutely crucial, as we have found out, crucial importance for someone who wanted to survive in hiding or trying to, as they called it, pass for Aryan, in other words, trying to pretend to be non-Jewish. So if you had knowledge of local customs, and most of all, if you could speak without an accent, which was not always the case, your chances for survival were, of course, greater. Second thing, big cities offered a degree of anonymity. So, in other words, going into hiding in places like Warsaw was a possibility. Now, hiding in a little town was it was one of our findings too. If you as a Jew went into hiding in a small town, your chances for survival were practically nil. You could survive either in a very remote rural area or in a big city. But in between, these little shtetls, they quickly became places of death because there was too much scrutiny, too little privacy. The Germans and local Polish authorities were at hand, and so we found out that the fate of these Jews was extraordinarily tragic in these locations.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the 9 counties, the 9 provinces that are laid out in the book, is there also a difference between them according to the geographical location and perhaps the ethnic composition of the population?
Yes, actually, it's interesting when we took these counties from various parts of Poland, north to south and to east. The most perhaps important part is the question of so-called Eastern experience, because in the east, what you have, the areas of eastern Poland in 1939 came under Soviet domination. So the Jews between 1939 and 1941 were actually under Soviet rule, which was brutal, but which was not deadly for most of the people over there. Now, in 1941, in the summer, after the German invasion of Soviet Union, these Jews are now already under Nazi rule. But the thing is that the occupation will last much shorter time than in the rest of Poland, because the front will come back in early 1944, mid-1944, and Jews in other parts of Poland will have to wait for liberation until January 1945. Now, these 7 months actually will be a very, very important difference, because the hunt for these unfortunate Jews will last until the very last days of occupation. So if you were on east of Vistula River or even further east, you were simply had a chance to be liberated in time. And if you were west of Vistula, then which is majority of our cases, then your chances were much slimmer.
Mm-hmm. Also, let's talk a bit about the methodology that you use in this book, which is microhistory. That's also part of the novelty of this book, as opposed to previous studies of the Holocaust, which look at the much larger scheme of things. It is as you lay out, different from local history. Can you say how?
Right. I mean, in this historical approach actually follows the people. So in other words, you are focusing on an area, but you are focusing also on individuals who migrate. You follow their fates. So you are not wedded to one territory only. You are looking at people who are basically moving through time and space. And this way, it's not only local history, it's more than local history. You see where these people flee, how many flee, where do they flee, how successful are they in their flight. So this is one of the aspects that allows you to make a local history combined with, let's say, trans history, which allows you to follow people over large distances. So this is actually possible. Best studies of this kind actually are done in Western Europe due to abundance of written evidence. In the East, it's much more complicated due to dearth, poverty of written evidence. Nevertheless, what we try to do is do something we call triangulation of memory, which is drawing upon German, Polish, and Jewish sources, which combined together allow you to build this micro-history in a more or less coherent way.
Well, why is it so much scarce in the East as opposed to the West?
Sorry?
Why are the sources so much more scarce?
Oh, well, first of all, occupation in the East did not really resemble much what happened in Holland or in France or in Belgium. The level of terror was much more elevated, and hence also the question of destruction of archives. Now, the sophistication of Western bureaucracy was without any comparison to what has happened or existed in Poland. Well, you know, the word bureaucracy comes from French. So if you look at the rosters of French police, they had lists of all practically Jews with their addresses, with their family build-up and so on, and their displacements over time between 1940 and 1942 or 43 to the last woman and child practically. The same thing goes for Holland. So this is, and in nothing like this existed in Polish occupied Polish territories. So simply we are dealing with many threads which sometimes are a dead end because the documentation simply is not available.
Yeah, and as you say in the book, this organized nature of the persecution also benefits you as a researcher and the micro-historical approach that you take, because it allows you to look at how the victims themselves adapted to the changing trends of the persecutors.
Right, and the thing with what happens here, but we were actually very interested in looking at, and what we found out was something called, perhaps not very nicely, Jewish agency, trying to see how these people whose fates were so, in such a horrible way, impacted by the German policies, tried to adapt to the changing circumstances. So we looked at various, we call it survival strategies, and you could see this great ingenuity of people who are, on the one hand, desperate, on the other hand, very resourceful in the face of death. So we had several aspects of this: where to hide, with whom to hide, and trying to survive on false documentation, and so on and so forth. Trying to calculate afterwards what were the chances in each of these fashions of survival, and so on and so on.
Do you have a personal favorite? You know, one person who tells the story well, I mean, that has insights for the broader understanding of that time.
Yes, actually, no, I was working on an area which is pretty interesting, or also quite troubling. It is a county called Węgrów, which is about 60 miles northeast of Warsaw. The thing is that it borders at the edge of this county. Treblinka was located. So the second largest extermination camp in Poland was located at the edge of this of that particular county, which had actually a horrifying impact on not only on Jews, of course, who were dying. 900,000 have been delivered of them to Treblinka and put to death, actually, in over 18 months. But also on the surrounding population. Now, my witness, I have many of these witnesses whom I sort of took to task and listened to. There were a couple of Jewish survivors who dug themselves out of common graves and went on to survive in order to bear witness after the war, to tell what happened to them and their families. But actually, one of these interesting witnesses is a Polish mayor of the city of Węgrów. His name was Okulus, a fellow who was a pre-war teacher who was thrust into position of authority by the Germans without any kind of, let's say, this political design on his part. He was rather somehow pushed out of, pushed into that situation, and he left a very important testimony about the fate of the Jews and the reactions of the Polish society, which is at the same time very informative and quite horrible. Basically, what you see is how it's death of morality the way we see it. That in the face of ongoing horror, human life, Jewish human life, it does not mean has no value at all. By mid-1942, in the eyes of non-Jews, Jewish life, many non-Jews, Jewish lives simply have no value. And this is reflected, of course, in very many testimonies, but the testimony of Mayor Okulus is very striking, since you have someone who is a member of local intelligentsia, well educated, and unable to answer the question, what is happening to my people? How come that deeds which are horrifying in normal times become normal? Become something accepted. This is also nature of microhistory, that you descend to the level of individual experience when the mayor says that his own court clerk is selling golden teeth, sometimes with part of jaws to which these teeth are attached, telling that he washed it. There is no blood because he washed it. I mean, the level of horrors that you can encounter is, of course, I don't want to multiply it, but the closer you get to these camps, and the areas of our study are littered with smaller camps, camps of forced labor, extermination sites, mass graves, and so on, you can see that something horrifying happens, which strikes the Jews in terms of death, and which strikes the local population in terms of moral, corruption and impact that is hard to measure but very visible.
Interesting. Fast forwarding to today, it's no secret that Holocaust scholarship has become much more difficult in Poland in recent years because of political pressures. And I want to ask you whether you've had to encounter any obstacles in researching this, and whether there were any sources that were inaccessible to you or made inaccessible to you. And really, are there any blind spots still left to this story because of political pressures?
I wouldn't say that we had any problems in gaining access to sources. Mind you, the fury of the authorities erupted after our book has been published in 2018 during the big crisis.
In Polish, originally.
In Polish, right, the original publication in Polish. Prior to this, of course, we could work in the archives. I think that it didn't change all that much. However, if one of our findings was that 2 out of 3 Jews who went into hiding, were killed, and most often they were killed with direct or indirect assistance of their Polish co-citizens, neighbors. So this was one of the findings which triggered this huge wave of hate and aggression on the part of Polish authorities against our group of authors of the book. But we didn't encounter before that. We had no problems in gaining access to sources in the archives. The only problem that we had constantly, and it's still ongoing, is lack of access to church archives. They are private archives, and Polish Catholic Church does not allow independent researchers to, let's say, penetrate into its own collections for fairly obvious reasons.
Yeah. What do you think these archives would say? You don't have to go into very minute details.
It is difficult to say because the only people who have access are vetted by the church, and they are singing the story which the church wants to hear. However, things which I would like to see is, for instance, the sermons, the texts of sermons given by priests, the correspondence between bishops and the priests. Now, mind you, in Poland, if you look at official church correspondence, there was word Holocaust, Shoah does not exist. The thing is that some priests individually or nuns helped the Jews. That happened, but in terms of official stand of the Polish church, it is beyond deadly silence. Actually, the only I might here say the only time when a Polish archbishop or bishop declared something about during the war about the Holocaust was a letter of Archbishop of Krakow, who wrote to German Governor Hans Frank on November 2nd, 1942. He said that it's awful that the Germans are using Polish youth, giving them vodka and making them take part in liquidating the ghettos because they are, striking against morality and corrupting the morality of Polish youth. That was the only time when officially a bishop or archbishop of Polish Catholic Church actually intervened, but in such a way. So there are many things I would like to see, but I probably will not be given access.
Mm-hmm. Also, the part of the story of the Polish attitudes during the war, especially in the counties that are to the east, so near the border with Ukraine, were also affected by Polish-Ukrainian tensions, conflict. I don't know really what the real word here is. Can you tell us a bit about that? And also, I'd like to know whether, again, speaking about in contemporary terms, whether that has affected the Polish stance on the current war in Ukraine and what they think about the situation.
Now, the thing is that we had two counties which had mixed population in terms of Belarusian or Ukrainian, and the interesting part is actually that when you look at the eastern parts, when the population is not Polish and Jewish only, but it's Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, it's interesting that the nationalities, that ethnicities which want to extend some help to Jews are let's say ethnic groups which feel threatened themselves. They feel more empathy. So, for instance, if you look at further east, where Poles are minority population, which is being hunted down actually by Ukrainians at certain point, you can see that there is a greatest chance for Jews who are hunted by everybody is to survive in Polish families, with Polish families who themselves feel threatened. Therefore, they are more likely to offer some kind of refuge to the Jews. It's interesting how your own situation changes your perspective on suffering of other people. Now, did it have any kind of impact on today's attitudes? I don't think so. What happened is, in Poland over the last 10 years, close to 1 million Ukrainians came to work since 2010 or so, and everybody in Poland started to recognize Ukrainians not as a distant threat, but as neighbors who actually are like you, who are speaking similar language, who in no time learn Polish, who actually fulfill all the working places that Poles don't want to take, and they became part of social fabric of in Poland. So once the invasion of Ukraine started, there was actually a very strong residual sentiment of, let's say, neighborly understanding, which did not exist before. Before, you had decades of mistrust, even hate, vengeance for alleged or real problems from war times. Nowadays, there was after these 10 years of cohabitation in Poland of million of Ukrainian guest workers, you could say that the society was ready to recognize them simply as, close cousins, so to say. Yeah.
Well, this is a fascinating issue that's worthy of a podcast in and of itself. But with you, Jan Grabowski, we'll have to stick with the Holocaust. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming today, a professor of history at the University of Ottawa and author of most recently Night Without End, The Fate of Jews in German-occupied Poland. It will be out in a couple of months over the
I
summer.
think end of August should be out.
Over the summer of 2022 in English, published by Indiana University Press and Yad Vashem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and once again to the Roth Institute for the generous support. And now we have a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Please check out our archive. It has about 750 episodes in it. And you can also like us on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.